The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
Whatever it takes. 3 words credited with saving the euro from collapse in 2012. But Mario Draghi, the man who said them, recently took on an even bigger task: saving Europe.
Europe's economic future. It may sound boring, but I promise you it isn't. This isn't just about things like tariffs or GDP or interest rates. It's about some fundamental things which many people here in Europe have come to take for granted: prosperity, security, and democracy.
The recently released Draghi report dedicates almost 400 pages to what the former ECB chief calls the existential challenge facing the EU economy. The central message: Europe is not productive or innovative enough, and if it doesn't take action now, it won't be able to survive in a world that's ever more hostile to it. In this episode, we speak to the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta and the Eurogroup President Paschal Donohoe, 2 other people tasked with remaking the EU economy for a world it wasn't designed for.
We are in a red alarm situation. We have to move, we have to act.
I definitely think there's an awareness amongst voters all over Europe regarding the degree to which the world is changing.
And we ask one of the leading commentators on the global economy, what's at stake if the EU comes up short?
This really is existential for Europe. If it doesn't solve these problems, it could literally collapse.
Welcome to Business Beyond.
The EU has faced several defining questions over the last 15 years, from the global financial crisis to the pandemic to the war in Ukraine. And now the re-election to the US presidency of Donald Trump for a second term has raised yet more existential questions for Europe.
Trump says he will put tariffs on European exports to the US, particularly on industrial sectors like car making, at a time when they're struggling. He has also repeatedly warned EU nations to increase their defence spending.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
I think this is a very profound shift in the world environment. In my own view, this is probably the most profound shift in the world environment of my lifetime.
Martin Wolf is a former World Bank economist who has been the Financial Times chief economic commentator for almost 30 years. He thinks Trump's re-election has fundamentally changed things for Europe and everyone else.
Well, my own view, alas, and it's immensely tragic, and I use that word advisedly, is that Trump's re-election is going to prove a historic event, possibly an irreversible one, for, first of all, the US itself and the way it operates. The US as a guarantor of security, the US as the country that created, preserved, defended the international liberal order, broadly defined. That's clearly going to be radically different. And a part of that is security relations, and part of it is economic relations.
Given what he has said about tariffs and defence, Trump's victory is forcing Europe to confront some hard truths about its own economic standing, particularly in relation to the US, but also in the world as a whole.
Using GDP, the standard measure of the value added to an economy through the production of goods and services, we can see how the gap between the size of the US and EU economies has widened since 2010. Total EU GDP now represents less than 3/4 of the US total. 20 years ago, the EU accounted for 1/4 of global GDP, just behind the US and way ahead of China. After that, both the US and EU shares declined as China experienced a dramatic surge. Over the last decade, the US share has increased again, while the EU's has been steadily declining.
But beyond all the individual crises that the EU has faced, it has known for a while that it has a bigger problem which it must handle. That's why it has compiled 2 major reports recently focusing on 2 economic areas. 1, its single market, and 2, its ability to compete in a world economy that's increasingly dominated by the US and China.
What's happened is a sort of form of learned helplessness. It's that they are aware there's a problem. And Draghi was asked, as was Enrico Letta, was asked to investigate these issues because people know there's a problem.
The Letta report and the Draghi report aim to guide the EU out of its current malaise. To understand the aim of these two major documents, we spoke with Enrico Letta, the author of the Letta report. He's a former Italian Prime Minister and the current Dean of IE University's School of Politics, Economics and Global Affairs in Madrid, Spain.
He says that Europe has to rediscover the true meaning and spirit of its much vaunted single market.
The idea is that we don't understand that the single market is the true jewel of the European Union, is the hidden gem.
Letta says that Jacques Delors, the hugely influential president of the European Commission from 1985 to 1995, told him before he died in 2023 that the EU had lost sight of its guiding mission.
He always told me they are forgetting the importance and the centrality of the single market. They are all forgetting this importance. And he always asked us at the Jacques Delors Institute to work on the single market, thinking that the single market is the true center of everything.
In a recent article, Martin Wolf listed what he sees as the EU's main problems. He wrote that the most important are fragmentation, over-regulation, inappropriate regulation, insufficient spending, and undue conservatism. Of these, fragmentation is the most damaging.
This is the idea that the single market doesn't really exist.
Despite the desire to create a single market, to create a banking union, an integrated financial system, to create an integrated capital markets, which imply, of course, highly integrated regulatory systems across the continent, across the EU, so that in essence businesses can operate as if Europe was one. The EU is clearly very, very far from that.
He says the clearest examples of this can be seen in banking and defence.
If we rescue banks, they will be rescued by states, member states. They won't be rescued by the EU acting together, because the EU as a whole has almost no fiscal firepower at all. So it's really, really hard in this situation to think about Europe from the point of view of the economy, the modern economy, as an integrated whole.
For Enrico Letta, healing this fragmentation is the central message of his report.
We think that we are one as the US and as China, but in reality, on too many economic issues, Europe is just a geographical expression. We are 27. And if we keep being 27, we will be, I would say, marginalized by the Americans and the Chinese. That is the main message.
The EU prides itself on its 4 freedoms: the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. But Enrico Letta says that it has been missing a 5th freedom, and that now is the time to set that right.
We missed the intangible, the digital. So the idea to launch this 5th freedom on innovation, knowledge, and to have everything related to this decision is, for me, a fundamental decision.
EU leaders agreed at a meeting in Budapest in November to work on the introduction of this intangible 5th freedom, agreeing in principle to a single market for research, innovation, knowledge and education, a direct response to the Letta and Draghi reports.
At the centre of the Draghi report is a call for Europe to become more productive. But it says that to do that, it needs to become more innovative. And to become more innovative, it needs to invest.
Since the financial crisis, investment rates in the US have outstripped those in the EU. In terms of private investment, the EU was ahead of the US until 2011, but the gap has widened significantly over the past few years. For government investment, US and EU rates have mirrored one another, but the US has also remained ahead. The comparison matters because many European startups opt to expand in the US rather than in the EU.
any business that sets up in America can regard the whole United States as its home market. It's much more difficult for a European business. The lack of a capital market union, for example, is one of the reasons that if you want to set up a startup, tech startup, it's so much more sensible to get yourself funded in America and then even move to America.
The consequences are easy to see. Here's the largest companies in the world by market capitalization. It's a list dominated by US firms. You have to go all the way down to number 20 to find a European firm, the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk. Among the most valuable US firms are the world's leading tech firms, Apple, Microsoft, and chip giant Nvidia, and they're worth in the trillions, not billions. Europe's biggest firms are much less valuable. The most valuable is at the same level as the US's 17th or 18th, depending on a day's given rates. And Europe's biggest firms deal in more old-fashioned consumer and healthcare products, rather than in more innovative technological fields. The Draghi report emphasises repeatedly that the EU must ramp up public and private investment. He even put an exact figure on it. The report states, to meet the objectives laid out in this report, a minimum annual additional investment of 750 to 800 billion euros is needed.
Well, I think that he went for a big number in the hope that people would be so frightened by the big number they would agree on a smaller one. I think he thought probably, I haven't talked to him about that. I have actually talked to him about the report. If he'd asked for a smaller number, people would have said, well, let's go for an even smaller number.
But it's not just public money. The report outlines that if Europeans invested more and saved less, it would go a significant way towards making up the shortfall.
Following the ECB numbers, there's around 300 billion euros per year. That is the total amount of money coming from European savings, leaving Europe to go to the US and being invested in the American market. Why? Because the American market is more united, big, and well-performing. So I started by saying, why don't we work to retain this big amount of savings in Europe, giving the possibility to European savers to invest them in Europe, in European savings tools that can give them a good return.
Europeans save a higher share of their GDP, significantly more, particularly private people, households, than in America or Britain for that matter.
Enrico Letta believes that private funding will help unlock public funding and that both are desperately needed.
Today, we understand very well that the big results we need, we can't get them only with public funding. If we are not able to mobilize private funding, it would be impossible. And to mobilize private funding, the only way is to create a single market on financial services in Europe. This is what we don't have today, and this is why I wanted to put this point at the center of the scene.
Mario Draghi's report lays out in stark detail what the EU needs to do in order to be able to compete with the US and China. But knowing what has to be done and actually being able to do it are two very different things.
Political instability is a problem, including in the two main EU drivers, France and Germany. France has had 4 prime ministers in a year, with President Emmanuel Macron looking increasingly weakened. Germany will hold elections next month after the previous 3-party government collapsed. Meanwhile, both countries have seen a significant rise in support for far-right parties, as have several other EU nations. Martin Wolf believes that Germany's reluctance to borrow big, exemplified by a constitutionally enshrined limit known as the debt brake, is holding the...
Nothing can happen here without Germany. It's clear, and Germany will have to take the lead, and it will have to be willing to do things that Germany's historically opposed. Concern about common borrowing, common revenue is well known. There's the debt brake, which I think will clearly have to go. It's clearly going to be part of the debate in the German election.
He thinks a fresh approach from a new German government could provide the EU with a lifeline.
If the German government came forward and said this is an epoch of change, we have to show the sort of ambition we did in when the EU, well, the EEC as it was founded. It was actually the European Coal and Steel Community was founded, and then the EEC in the 50s. The single market and the single currency, they're going to have to show a willingness to do that sort of thing.
Enrico Letta wants to see Europe forge a closer single market in 3 specific areas: energy, telecoms and financial services. He believes a lot can be done in a short space of time without the need for changes to existing EU treaties.
The period of COVID and also the period of the beginning of the war, the Russian aggression to Ukraine, demonstrate that within the European treaties there are a lot of tools that we can use to avoid, I would say, complicated discussions on treaty changes. And we have not to open the Pandora box of treaty changes, because otherwise it will be impossible to be successful.
It's clear that some big decisions have to be made here in Brussels and across the European continent. And to consider some of the key questions and the issues involved, we spoke with Paschal Donohoe. He's the president of the Eurogroup, which is the collection of the 20 finance ministers which make up the Eurozone. Eurogroup President Paschal Donohoe, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Business Beyond.
Not at all. Delighted to be on your programme.
Now, I believe this is the first gathering of the Eurogroup since the re-election to the presidency in America of Donald Trump. My first question to you today would be, is Europe ready for Trump 2.0?
So I believe Europe will be ready for Trump 2.0 because we have a track record of being able to adjust to really big strategic developments that takes place elsewhere in the world. But we do have work that we need to do. We need to deepen the foundations of the euro with regard to capital markets, with regard to banking union. And we also need to look at what further steps we can take to deepen the competitiveness of the European Union. As we furnish and develop a new relationship with the United States, we need to do it from a position of greater strength than we have at the moment.
Well, I definitely want to get into some of those issues a little later. But just to step back a little bit and we look at events all over the world over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, the world has gotten a lot unfriendlier all of a sudden. I mean, we can look at Russia, we can look at China. It's a different strand of issues, but nonetheless considerably less friendly to Europe as it perhaps was in the past. And now indeed, one of our closest allies, the US, there's a lot of uncertainty, as you've alluded to, in that relationship. So when you look at the EU and how it's structured, particularly from an economic perspective, is it fair to say that the EU wasn't built necessarily for this type of a new world that we're in?
So the EU is a collection of democracies. Sometimes does take longer to adjust to big developments than other forms of political governance. But a consequence of our decision making, though, is that when we do make decisions, they are resilient, they hold, and we have the ability to take big decisions over time. So I think there's no doubt at all that all of the change that we've seen happen, even in recent weeks, from what's happening in America to what's happening in the Middle East, does remind me that there's a volatility in the world that we haven't seen for some time. But I would argue, though, that stability still has big benefits, particularly if you're a collection of democracies as the EU is. And I'm confident that we will be able to rise to the challenges that are now developing at some speed.
And we could talk, for example, about some of the minutiae of, say, the issues that the Trump presidency could bring in, such as tariffs. We could talk about more general economic themes like inflation and so on. But the EU has clearly been aware for a while that some of these problems that are mounting go beyond these relatively short-term issues. And for that reason, there's been 2 big reports commissioned this year. The Letta report, obviously looking at the single market, and then the Draghi report on competitiveness. Why do you think these reports were so necessary, and what have you, as Eurogroup President, taken from them?
So they are so necessary because of the volatility that you described earlier on. We can see big changes that are taking place in Europe, much of which is due to the consequences of the war and what has also happened with the cost and the availability of energy. But in addition to all of that happening, we have very big global developments taking place as we see other parts of the world, from China to India to America, changing their economic stance And we've also seen their economic growth in recent years continue to be very strong, and their medium-term economic outlook also continue to be very strong. So these pieces of work reassessing where Europe stands in the world and where the euro area stands in the world, we're responding back to the changes that we've seen taking place. In terms of what we're doing within the Eurogroup with regard to this, I'd highlight 3 pieces of work. Firstly, what is the right budget policy for the euro area and for member states of the euro area to get the balance right between having safe public finances but investing in our future. Second, it's the work that we have underway with regard to capital markets union, which has taken time, but we shouldn't underestimate the ability of continuing to make decisions in this area, but maybe accelerating the pace of that decision making so that we can deepen and integrate our capital markets within the euro area. And the Eurogroup has done a lot of work on this. And then finally, I would argue that the digital future of the euro is also a very strategic response back to the way in which we see the global economy beginning to change.
Just on that topic of budget decisions, I mean, we'll get onto the Draghi report now. One of the big headlines from the Draghi report was his mention of a figure of an extra 800 billion euros a year that's needed, in his view, for the EU to catch up in some of those areas that you've touched on, whether it's innovation and sort of digital innovation and entrepreneurship, essentially, to try and catch up with that considerable gap that has now emerged between European companies and American companies and indeed Chinese companies. Do you think the EU can come up with that kind of a figure, and how do you think it could do this?
Yes, I believe we can, and I believe there's 2 ways in which we will do it. Firstly, it will go back to the opportunity that is there regarding private savings within the European Union and how we can coordinate them in a way that delivers a better benefit for Europeans and for the European Union. If you have a look at how many other parts of the world have managed the investment needs that they have, you've seen them make far smarter use of the savings and investment funds of their own citizens than we've been able to do in the European Union. So that is a big part of that jigsaw, and the other part of the jigsaw will then be decisions that we make regarding funding the budget of the European Union and the willingness of member states to look at new forms of public funding that deliver European public goods, in other words, European collective benefits. And that will be a big part of the negotiation for the next budget of the European Union, some of which will involve choices regarding priorities, what areas are going to be more important in the years ahead than they have been in the years that have gone by. Others will undoubtedly involve a debate regarding whether there's a need for new economic instruments.
Now, we have viewers from all over the world, and you already alluded to this earlier, that there's whole parts of the world, for example, in India, Indonesia, what's sometimes referred to as the global south, and other countries all over the place, where they will look at Europe and they look at European companies and they will just think that's yesterday's world. That's a different type of world. The world's changing, as you've hinted at in many ways. Why should they look at Europe now and think, well, actually, no, that's going to be tomorrow's world as well? That's an innovative place that we need to have our stake in as well as the world changes.
Well, we need to give them further reason to believe that. The perception and views of different parts of the world ebbs and flows. But when you're dealing with a perception issue, I think you need to look at a level beyond that and say, what's the substance? And what we need to do is look at what are the policy decisions that we need to make that will build on the success that we have, that in turn will allow the view of Europe to be recast by other parts of the world. So from my point of view, our ability to fix a perception issue will only be delivered when we address the substance of the issues that is causing other parts of the world to look at Europe in a more critical way. And the way in which we will do it is by decisions that we can make ourselves, that I believe we can make over the next 1 to 2 years.
And to make these decisions, obviously, we need governments working together, but we also need populations working together. And this comes at a time when you have significant discord in a lot of countries. You have, for example, I've mentioned France, I've mentioned Germany, a lot of support there for far-right movements. It's not impossible to imagine, for example, Marine Le Pen as the future president of France. It's not impossible to imagine the AfD in Germany getting a significantly larger share of the vote. We see what's happening in Romania at the moment, where a far-right candidate has been doing very well in elections there. How can Europe stay united on some of these issues when you have this sort of populism rising all across the continent?
By pointing to the benefits of the European Union and making the case for a contemporary rationale for the European Union and for European and political and economic integration, which is to simply say that because the opportunities that we face and the challenges that we face are so big that no one European country on their own is capable of rising to them. And that we can achieve more together by acting collectively. And if we don't act collectively, the national loss will even be greater. So for me, there's a deeply practical argument to be made regarding the role of the European Union. I can make many arguments about the political value of it, about the optimism of it. I can make many arguments about our historical background and why we're showing a very different way for Europe in its future versus where we have been in our past. But for many, we need to make a more practical argument at a time of populism and at a time of division. And that practical argument is, as I said, that because the change in the world is so big, no one country can rise to it on their own, no matter how big they are in Europe.
Paschal Donohoe, President of the Eurogroup, thank you very much for joining us today on Business Beyond.
Thank you very much.
The European Union is a complex and diverse place. 27 different national governments and economies, a kaleidoscope of cultures and languages, and a wide range of different political and legal systems. Yet for most of the post-World War II order, the European Union has found a way not just to stick together, but to thrive together. Yet to secure its future, the EU must bind these threads together more tightly than ever, at a time when their fraying can be seen all across the continent.
These are civilizational questions. They're not just about the way people live from day to day. Europe is going to be challenged to be able to stand up for itself and to provide a decent living for its citizens and hope for the future for its citizens.
There's the link between two words that will be crucial, and the two words are competitiveness and security. If we are not able to integrate the three sectors that I put at the center of my report, energy, telecom, and financial services, it will be impossible to be secure and at the same time to be competitive.
The world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And many Europeans are beginning to feel that a global order which has served them well for a long time is beginning to turn against them.
The states and the EU together could disintegrate. You can't assume that what we used to will last. That's what history tells us, and particularly European history of the 20th century, is if you make really big mistakes, things can collapse completely. The EU dream could collapse and our economies could collapse. And then the future becomes very dark and very unpredictable.
In 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, Jacques Delors said the following: "Europe will never be built if young people do not see it as a collective undertaking that will shape their future." Nearly 4 decades later, the continent's leaders face the same problem. Europe's fate depends on their ability to find the solution.
That's all for this episode of Business Beyond. If you'd like to see more from us, check out our playlist in the description. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.